It was April 1945. The world that once knelt in fear before Adolf Hitler's armies was now standing over the ruins of his empire. Berlin, once the shining capital of the Third Reich, was a smoldering graveyard of shattered dreams and broken promises. The man who once declared that his reign would last 1,000 years was now hiding beneath the city he had doomed, trapped in a cold, damp bunker where sunlight no longer reached. Above him, the sky was red with fire. Below him, the silence was broken only by the distant rumble of Soviet artillery and the shallow breathing of those who still followed him into the abyss. For years, Hitler had fed himself on the illusion of destiny, that he was chosen, untouchable, eternal. Every defeat he brushed aside as a test from fate. Every loss he painted as a temporary shadow before inevitable triumph. But now, in that underground tomb of steel and concrete, even fate had gone silent. The walls of the Fuhrer bunker dripped with moisture, the air thick with cigarette smoke and despair. Maps covered the walls, maps full of red arrows pointing to counterattacks that existed only in his imagination. He would stare at them for hours, lost in a fantasy where Germany still had an army, still had hope. His generals knew the truth, but none dared to say it out loud. The Reich was dead, it just hadn't stopped breathing yet. They begged him to escape to the mountains, to regroup, to save himself. But Hitler's pride was sharper than reason. He said, "I will not run like a coward, I will die in Berlin." He could not bear the thought of retreat. To him, surrender was worse than death. It was a betrayal of the myth he had built, the myth of the infallible Führer. But behind those pale blue eyes, something was breaking. The mask of destiny had cracked, and what lay beneath was not a god, but a terrified old man facing his own collapse. The illusion began to unravel when Hermann Göring, his oldest ally, his chosen successor, sent a telegram suggesting he take command if Hitler was cut off in Berlin. To anyone else, it would have been common sense, but to Hitler, it was betrayal. He flew into a rage, screaming, ordering Göring's arrest, calling him a traitor. But deep down, he knew what it meant. Even his inner circle no longer believed in him. The empire he once controlled from the Atlantic to the Volga was gone. German cities lay in ruins. Children were now soldiers. Mothers were digging graves in the streets. The mighty Reich had become a starving ghost of itself. Yet in the bunker, Hitler clung to madness. He spoke of a miracle, General Steiner's counterattack, a phantom army that would crush the Soviets and save Berlin. But Steiner had no troops, no tanks, no chance. When his staff finally told Hitler that Steiner hadn't moved, something inside him shattered. Witnesses said he trembled uncontrollably, his voice rising to screams, his fists pounding the table as he cursed his generals, his soldiers, even the German people. It was no longer anger, it was desperation. The man who once ruled by sheer willpower was now breaking under the weight of his own delusions. When he finally stopped, there was only silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the words no one thought he would ever speak. "The war is lost." He dismissed everyone from the room. When they returned, he was pale and calm. The rage was gone. In its place was something worse, acceptance. He no longer spoke of victory or destiny. He spoke only of death. He told his aides that he would stay in Berlin and end his life when the time came. Outside, the Soviet guns roared closer each hour. The city was collapsing street by street, building by building. Civilians fled through burning rubble. Soldiers, too young to shave, fought hopeless battles with rifles older than they were. Inside the bunker, time stood still. Food was nearly gone, power flickered, and the smell of fear mixed with the stench of smoke and sweat. Secretaries wept quietly at night, knowing that the end was crawling closer with every explosion. By mid-April, betrayal surrounded him. Himmler was secretly negotiating surrender. Goebbels, the master of propaganda, had begun to crumble emotionally. His generals, once symbols of loyalty and pride, were dead, captured, or fleeing. The man who once commanded millions now ruled over ghosts and shadows. He still kept a portrait of Frederick the Great on his desk, the king who once turned defeat into victory. He would stare at it for hours, as if the painting would whisper one last miracle. But no miracle came. The sound of battle was now directly above them. Each thundering shell felt like a countdown. Then came the news that broke even his delusions. Benito Mussolini, his ally, his mirror, had been captured, executed, and hung upside down in a public square. He read the report in silence. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, softly, he muttered, "I will not suffer Mussolini's fate." And in that quiet declaration, he sealed his own. That night, as the world outside burned, he married Eva Braun. There was no romance, no joy, only ritual. They toasted with cheap champagne under the flicker of dying lamps while artillery thundered above. Witnesses said he was strangely calm, even gentle, as if the storm inside him had finally gone still. The next day, the Soviets were only blocks away. Berlin was no longer a city, it was a grave. He gathered his staff, thanked them, and gave his final orders. All documents were to be burned, his body destroyed. He could not bear the thought of being paraded like Mussolini. Even at the end, his obsession with image outweighed his concern for humanity. And then, in that silent room that had seen the fall of an empire, he took the pistol, sat beside Eva, and ended the nightmare he had created. A single gunshot echoed through the bunker, a sound that marked the end of a tyrant and the death of his delusion. His guards carried the bodies up to the garden. Under a gray, smoky sky, they burned them as ordered, even as Soviet shells rained down. Above ground, the Reich had already crumbled to ash. Below ground, its architect had become one.
When the Soviets entered days later, they found the bunker like a tomb left behind by madness. Maps scattered on the floor, food half-eaten, letters written in shaky hands. The air was thick, stale, heavy with the ghost of what once was. The world that Hitler tried to build through hate and terror had vanished, leaving only silence. Berlin fell on May 2nd. Within a week, Nazi Germany surrendered. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. Yet the story didn't die there. Rumors spread like wildfire. Whispers that Hitler had escaped, that he was alive in Argentina, that he would return. But those were just the final illusions of a people who couldn't face the truth. Because the truth was simpler, darker, and far more human. Adolf Hitler didn't lose the war in that bunker. He lost it years earlier, the moment he began to believe he could not lose at all. The bunker was only where that lie finally died. When the smoke cleared and the guns fell silent, the world stood still, listening to what remained. There were no speeches, no parades, no glory. Only the silence of a city turned to dust. The silence of a man who had tried to play God and discovered he was only mortal.
The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of what had been would not fade so easily. Berlin was no longer a city, but a scar on the earth, its streets unrecognizable, its people wandering through ruins like ghosts, searching for something they had lost long before the war ended. The Soviets raised their red flag over the Reichstag, and the world finally saw what the cost of one man's madness had been. But beneath the victory, beneath the relief, there was something else, something darker, a question that hung in the smoke-filled air. How could a single man convince millions to follow him into destruction? In the weeks after Hitler's death, the bunker became more than a place. It became a symbol. Journalists, soldiers, and survivors all told their versions of what had happened there. Some said he died with dignity, others said he died in fear. But the truth, buried under layers of rubble and propaganda, was simpler. He died the same way he had lived, trapped in his own illusion. The world outside tried to move on. Allied soldiers uncovered the concentration camps, where mountains of bodies told stories more powerful than any speech could. Villages that had once shouted Heil Hitler now whispered his name in shame. The German people stared at the ruins of their homes and wondered how they had believed so deeply, so blindly. In small towns, widows waited for husbands who would never return. Children dug through the rubble for food, and soldiers who had once marched with pride now hid their uniforms in fear. The war had ended, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the bombs that had fallen. Europe was broken, not just in buildings, but in spirit. Across oceans, the world breathed again. Newspapers announced the end of the war in Europe. Crowds danced in the streets of London and New York. Flags waved, bells rang, and tears flowed. But behind every celebration, there was a quiet recognition. Victory could never erase what had been lost. Historians would later say the war ended on May 8, 1945, but for millions, it would never truly end. The shadows it cast would stretch for generations. The fear, the guilt, the memory of what humans could do when they believed hate was destiny. In the ashes of Berlin, new nations began to rise. Germany was divided, its heart split by walls of ideology and suspicion. The world that emerged was colder, cautious, aware now that even civilization could fall into darkness if it followed a voice too long. And yet, the memory of the bunker remained, a relic of madness, a monument not to power, but to its limits, a place where a man who wanted to rule the world discovered, too late, that the world cannot be ruled by fear forever.